Hello everyone, today we continue learning REDIS in Python, and today I'll explain keys, scan, incur and incurby commands in REDIS. So let's start. First of all, I want to say that if you haven't seen my last video about REDIS, where I explained what is that, why we need REDIS, and some basic things about REDIS, then you should watch it. But if you have seen that video, that is the second part, and let's dive into it. So today we'll talk about, again, scan versus keys command and incur versus incurby commands. What are they doing, why do we need them, and how to properly use them in our applications. And we'll also write some applications, some simple applications in Python. So let's start. In the last video, I started REDIS using my exe file, so executable file, but now I want to show you that you can start it from Docker. Docker is another technology that you can use to run all sorts of things, so it's kind of like virtualization, and I'll not explain anything about Docker today because it's an enormous technology, and yeah, it's just enormous. I cannot just do it in one video. And that video is not related to the Docker, so if you want me to make another video on Docker, on how to use it, then just tell me that. So what you can do is install Docker on your machine and or use REDIS as an executable file, as I did it in the previous lecture. So that is just the method of running REDIS. And I like it because I can literally run any version of the REDIS, and if you have seen my last video, you know that I have an obsolete version of REDIS as an executable file. But now in Docker, what I can do, I can literally run REDIS 01 6379 6309. I can literally run any version of the REDIS. So what I'm doing right here, I'm saying Docker run a container, so you can think of it as a virtual machine. If you know Docker, you know what that command does. But I'm saying Docker run the machine with ports, with exposed ports from localhost 6379, 6379. So REDIS works at the port 6379 by default. And because of that, I need to expose those ports to my local machine. And after that, I'm saying run REDIS latest version. So let's run it and let's wait for a minute. And as you can see, REDIS is starting, REDIS version 6.2.5. In the previous video, I had version 4.2.0 as far as I'm concerned, but that's just how you can start your REDIS applications. And as you can see, or any applications, your containers. So Docker is a really great technology and you should learn it. I'll also make a video on it. But now, if you want to just run your REDIS in Docker, copy that command and everything will work for you. As you can see, I have my REDIS right here, so in order to make things easier for me, I'll just close that terminal, if it will be closed. Yeah, and I'll just run my, or rerun my REDIS from here. So now everything works. Okay, what I want to do now let's open a CLI. So if you are on Docker in your Linux system, so if you don't have that Docker UI, what you can do is use docker exec it, then ID of your Docker container, and use bash. So just Google on how to run any command from the Docker, on how to get inside of the Docker container. Yeah, but I'll just click here and it will open a CLI for me. So now that terminal is inside of my Docker container. That's a Linux system, so I can write uname, and as you can see, it's a Linux. So I'm kind of like in a virtual machine where I have my REDIS, and because I have my REDIS, I have my REDIS CLI. So I can write that, and as you can see right now, I'm in my REDIS CLI. So I can set keys, as we did it in the previous video, I can get those keys, and everything works. Again, that's just a way of running REDIS. You can totally do what I did in the previous lecture, but that way is much more comfortable for me and for almost anyone who uses any kind of applications, because Docker is really, really great for your development and for production purposes. Okay, so now I'm in my REDIS CLI, and let's talk about commands that we will discuss today. First of all, let's talk about incur versus incurby. So what that command does? Command incur literally just increments your variable. For example, let's set our a variable to 0. And then what I can do is write incur, and I need to write my key, for example a. What I'll do when so I can incur and the name of your key. When I press enter, as you can see, our key or the result is 1, integer 1 right here. If I'll do it again, the result is 2, then 3, 4, 5, 6. So now, what are we doing? We literally just incrementing our variable by 1, and we can check that using get a. So as you can see, our variable was 6 as the result of incur a, and again we return 6 right here. But you should understand that REDIS or REDIS standard keys that we use using get, set, delete, so just standard keys in REDIS, do not support integers. An integer is returned right here as a result of incur a, incur any key. So when you're writing incur, the integer is returned as a result, but you should understand that REDIS does not support integers. So if you are working with REDIS using some kind of TCP connection, if you, for example, just watching that video but you have no idea about Python, you are using Java, for example, with REDIS, or JavaScript with REDIS, so any kind of the language, you need to understand that your wrappers, so the wrappers around REDIS that will help you to work with the REDIS database, will not translate everything into integers. So now, as you can see, incur a returns an integer, but when I'm using get a, it returns a string. Well, actually those are bytes, but a string. I'll call it like that, so you understand what I mean. So REDIS does not support integers by default, so we don't have an integer type in REDIS. What we have is bytes, and in our case, command incur, what it does, it translates, serializes, so it converts a string or bytes into an integer, and after that it increases the counter, then it converts the counter back to bytes to set it as the new value of the key. So you need to understand that. In our case, when I'm writing incur, I return an integer, but when I'm using get, I get a string. And you will see that when we will use our REDIS or when we will work with incur command in our Python application. So that's how it works. Let me check that. Yeah, everything is okay with the recording. Just wanted to check. And now that's just incur command. But what will happen if, for example, instead of value as 0, as 10, as an integer, I'll set, for example, hello. Well, actually, if I write incur a, so again, I set the value of an a key as hello, and if I write incur a, I'll see error, value is not an integer or out of range. So what does that mean? I think you understand what does that mean. The first part, so value is not an integer, I think it's obvious. So we cannot increment hello value because it's not an integer. How we can increment it? Like, there's no possible way. Or out of range. So that part is obvious as well, because out of range means that our variable may be, we may, how to say it? So in every programming language, there are boundaries. For example, in C programming language, your integer takes up to 4 bytes. So when you write an integer a equals something, it takes 4 bytes. And if you have only worked with Python, you didn't, well, you might have experienced the problem, but in Python we have a specific type of arithmetic. So in our case, in Python, when we are writing a really big integer, Python literally makes the storage for that integer bigger and bigger and bigger. And we can go up to gigabytes, to megabytes, so it doesn't matter in Python. We can write any integer that we want. But in a lot of programming languages, as well as C, and if you don't know, REDIS is written on C or C++, well, on C. And in C, there is a specific range for all of the integers. So what does that mean? If our integer is big enough, it will return an error. So if I write incur a forever, at one point my incur a will always return a problem or an error, an exception, because our integer will be out of range. So that means that you can use incur for a really long periods of times, but you cannot use it forever. Yeah, that's just it. So you need to take that in account when you're writing some kind of applications, because in Python it's really easy to write anything that you want without worrying about the numbers, because again, Python can make its storage bigger for any variable that you need. For example, if you want to make a variable with only one value, for example, I don't know, set a as 0 in Python, a equals 0, you take up for, I don't know, 2 bytes of memory. But if you make your variable with 1 million zeros at the end, so yeah, I'm talking too much. If you, Python can enlarge its memory dynamically. That's what I meant. Okay, but a lot of technologies, a lot of databases cannot do that. So you need to take that in account, and in Redis as well. You need to take in account that incur can return an error at one point because of your out of range, because of the ranges of the integers in Redis. That's what I meant. Okay, if you want to check what are the ranges, then you can write C, you can Google C int range, like that, and it will give you like the real ranges of ranges in C programming language. So what are the ranges of an integer in C? Okay, what are the numeric ranges? So what is the minimum and the maximum of an integer? Okay, I think that's great. Now let's talk about float values. So again, I said that Redis does not have any like real numeric values inside of it. So what will happen if I write set a as 1.5? Let's do it. It says okay. Yeah, that's okay, because we are using 1.5 as a string. Right here, as you can see, it's a string. Well, these are Unicode bytes, but again, I will say that that is a string, because it's more convenient for me and for a lot of people. Okay, but what will happen if I write incur a right now? Well, in every programming language, it should give us the result and as 2.5, because we just append 1 or increment our value by 1. In our case, it will give us an error, because still 1.5 is not an integer, and when Redis tries to convert our 1.5 to an integer, it obviously returns an error. So that means that incur command can only be used with real integers, like with really integers, only like real values, real integer values, no floats, no doubles, no strings. So yeah, that's what I want to say to you. And now let's talk about another command, which is, and by the way, if you want to, for example, set key as -10, you can totally do it. And if we write incur, as you can see, -9, -10, -8, -7, -6. So you can only put real integers, but it doesn't matter if that integer is negative or positive when you're using it with incur command in Redis, because still it's an integer. Okay, that's what I wanted to say. But now, what if I want to add, for example, 10? What if I want to add 10 instead of 1? So in our case, when we are using incur a gives us 1. But what if I want to add 10 at once? Well, then we have our incur by command, because incur by command accepts 2 arguments. First of all, the key, for example, a, and then the increment, for example, 10. So in our case, now, as you can see, our variable a is 1, because I wrote incur from a, but now when I write incur by a 10, that means that we increment our variable a by 10. And as you can see, the result is 11. So I can literally get it, and as you can see, 11 as well. So incur by command literally does the same as incur, but it accepts another argument, which is the amount of numbers that you want your integer to be incremented by. Yeah. So for example, if I can write incur a like that, incur a 12, but if I want to add like 5 values, 1000 values, incur by, for example, a 1 and that big number. Yeah, as you can see, it's out of range because it's very big. But if I write something like that, as you can see, okay, so as you can see, I can write anything that I want, but if I write a very big number, it will be out of range because that is a really big number for C programming language. But I can still write it in Python, so let's literally copy it. And what we can do in Python is use a equals that, print a plus 1. And when I run it, as you can see, I can see the result of the calculation. So in Python, everything's alright, but in other technologies, programming languages, it can be a problem. Okay, but if I write a small number, incurby will literally append it to my value. Again, you can only use integers in incurby as you do it in incur. And what you can do in incurby is use negative integers. For example, if I will set a as 0 and then I write incur by a minus 10, what I will see, an integer is minus 10. So my new value for the a key is minus 10. That's how it works. So you can literally just put any values that you want as long as those values are integers. So if I put incur by minus 10.2, for example, again, it will give me an error. So incur and incurby commands work with integers, but the only difference between them that incur increments your variable by 1, but incurby can help you to add or subtract the value that you want to subtract or add to your value. For example, in our case, it's minus 10 or that big number or that big number or any number that you want. Okay, so that is the real difference. Now let's exit our Redis CLI and let's exit our container from our Docker instance. And what I want to do right now? Right now I want to make a simple counter. For example, a counter that will increase every second. How we can do that in Redis? First of all, let's import in Redis and Python. Let's first of all import time module because we need it to in order to work with time. And let's import Redis module. So if you haven't watched my previous video, you need to install Redis with pip install Redis. Like that. So as you can see, requirement is already satisfied for me, but you will install it and everything will be alright. Now, what we want to do? We want to create a Redis instance. And in order to do that, what we can do is use redis.redis. Like that. And in the previous video, I provided values for the host, for the port, for the database of our Redis. But now let's look at them. You can see that pop up, and as you can see, it says host equals localhost, port equals 6379, db equals 0. What does that mean? That means that in that specific application, and you need to listen closely, in that specific application, I can omit these values because my Redis is running on localhost on my local computer and on port 6379. But you should never omit these values in your real production environment or in any application that you want to save, that you want to write for some specific purpose, because you typically have Redis on other servers. So for example, you have your web development server and then web server. You have your web server and then you have your Redis server in some other computer, so somewhere else. And because of that, what you need to do is use host as, for example, redis.com, something like that. And because of that, what you need to do is provide all of the variables that you see right here. Not all of the variables, but host, port, db, and password should always be provided in your Redis creation while you create your Redis client, right? Like that. But in our case, because I'm writing that simple application and I will delete it later, what I can do is omit those values. That's it. So let's create our Redis client as redis.redis. Then let's close our Redis client. So when we create our Redis client, we open a connection. And when we close our Redis client, we literally close the connection. And if you have worked with Python files, with Python open function, then you know about context managers. So context managers are operations, or not operations, but statements that help you to execute some work without writing additional excessive code. For example, what we can do is, instead of using Redis client equals Redis client close, we can, instead of that, put with Redis client as Redis client. So as you can see what I'm doing right here, I'm creating a Redis connection as a Redis client variable. If you have no idea about context managers, I think I've made a video on them, but I'm not sure. There are tons of videos on the internet, so there are tons of information on the internet. Videos, articles about context managers in Python and how beneficial they are. So you can watch or read one of them. So again, I'm opening the Redis right here and I'm closing it on the 8th line. So everything inside of my context manager will be connected to Redis. That's how it works. Okay, now what I want to do, and let's check that it works. As you can see, process finished with execute 0, so that means that everything is alright. What we need to do right now? Right now, let's create our counter. So what do we need to do? First of all, we need to create a variable, because when we worked with incur command, we provided a real variable as the second value of incur. So for example, incur A, incur B, incur key. So in order to create a key value pair in Redis to create a variable, what we need to do is, of course, use set command. Set, for example, counter as value 0. Now, our Redis will have counter set to 0. And after that, what we can do is use while true, Redis client.incur. So as you can see, we have incur and incur by command right here. So incur by float. Incur by float. Is there a command incur by float? Really? I just want to check it because I didn't knew that there was a command like that. So let's print it. Let's see. Oh my. Really? So as you can see, there is a command incur by float. I had no idea that it exists. Oh. Well, that's great. So as you can see, incur by float can accept float values. That's great. Maybe you have incur float command. I don't think so, but let's check. No, we don't have incur float command, but we have incur by float. So yeah, that's really great. I had no idea that that command existed in Redis, but yeah, as you can see, incur by float accepts a float value, so double float, whatever you call it, as the amount argument for your counter. And you can literally put float values in here. That's great. Yeah, that's great. As you can see, we have float values right here. So yeah, if you want to work with float values, then you can use incur by float. But of course, we'll work with simple integer values, so we'll use simple incur command right here. So in our case, what are we doing right here? We print Redis client.incur counter, so we increment our counter by 1. And after that, I said that our counter will be incremented every second. What we need to do is use time sleep 1. So in Python, time sleep, it's a function that will pause your main thread, so pause your application, if you want me to say it like that, for 1 second or for 10 seconds, but I write 1, so we don't wait for a really long period of time. Let's run it. And now what are we doing? First of all, we set our counter as 0. And after that, we increment our counter, and as you can see, it's being incremented. So if I open my Redis CLI, let's call Redis CLI, what I can do is get counter. As you can see, it's 15, 17, 17, 18. So it's being incremented every second. And that's just really great. So that's how it actually works. Yeah, that's a simple program for Redis that has a counter. That counter is saved inside of Redis. It works perfectly, so it literally increments your counter by 1 every second. That's how it works. Okay, so that was about incur by, incur, and as we know it right now, incur by float commands. And let me check if Redis CLI incur by float. Oh yeah, as you can see, there is a command incur by float. Yeah, that's really great. Okay, so as you can see, we talked about incur, incur by, and incur by float commands today. That's how it works. But now let's talk about other commands that are beneficial for us. So now, if I open my Redis CLI once again, what if I want to see all of the keys that are in my Redis right now, in my database? What I can do? Well, actually, there are 2 commands that can help you with that. if you want to see all of the keys that you have inside of your REDIS. The first comment is keys. But what is pattern? As you can see, the second argument is pattern. What is that? So the pattern is a wildcard expression. Wildcard expression is an expression when you have wildcards. Wildcards are stars, if you want to name them like that. So star means that you can have anything that you want. For example, if you want your key to end with counter, what you can do is use star. So your key can be anything at the beginning and then use counter, like that. So what does that mean again? Star means any amount of symbols, any amount of symbol. So it literally means everything. So your key can start with anything, but it should end with counter. But what will happen if we write just a star? Again, a star means everything. In our case, we'll get all of the keys. So let's check it. And as you can see, we get all of the keys that are in our REDIS. What if I want to get all of the... let's test our counter theory. So as you can see, when we use keys with wildcard counter, we only get the counter. If you just put counter, you'll get the same result. But if you, for example, put get, or let's create a new key set and put my underscore counter, for example 10. What will happen if you use keys from counter? As you can see, you only get the counter because it literally matches your key name. But if you use counter with a star at the beginning, you get both keys that you want. In our case, we get my counter and just the counter. That's how it works. So wildcard expression is really beneficial for you, and you can put wildcards wherever you want. For example, you can put them inside of the words. For example, it should have a letter C inside of it. So our key should have a letter C inside of it, and it should end with R. For example, counter. Yeah, it matches the pattern, and if I run it, as you can see, my counter and counter. But if I run, for example, M, R, only my counter will be as the result of the keys operation. That's how it works. So again, keys comment lists all the keys that are in your REDIS, and it helps you with wildcard expressions. So you can list all the keys with different wildcard expressions. Those help you with getting all of your keys, and you'll find yourself using keys all when you work with REDIS in development environment. But as I said, we will use keys versus scan. And why do we need scan? What's the difference between keys and scan? Let's see. First of all, let's create a program that will, for example, add a lot of keys, a lot of random keys to our REDIS database. So with redis.redis as REDIS client, what we need to do? We need to import random, like that, and import random because we need to make a lot of random keys in Python. And what we can do in here is use random.sample. So random.sample will get the list. For example, it will get a string, yeah, A, B, C, D, E, and it will get k random characters. So as you can see, the first argument is population, so your iterable, your string, your list, your array, in short words. And the second argument is k, so how much or how many elements you want to get from that array. For example, if I want to get 2 elements, let's print it, print random sample 2. As you can see, we get B, C. And in our case, we have a string module in Python. So let's go inside of the string module. If you wonder how I did it, I pressed Ctrl and clicked on my string module in PyCharm. And as you can see, what it has right here, it has a lot of variables that will help us with strings. So in our case, we have white space characters, ASCII lowercase, ASCII uppercase, ASCII letters. So ASCII lowercase and uppercase are English alphabets in lower and uppercase. And what we can do is use ASCII letters as a container for the sample. So what I'll do, let's import from from string import ASCII letters, and after that, inside of my sample, I'll use those ASCII letters. Let's run it now, and as you can see, we get LV, so 2 random characters. If I write, for example, 20, I'll get 20 random characters. But what we can do is write random.rand integer from 1 to, I don't know, 20, and now we'll get a random amount of symbols from 1 to 20. So again, random integer gives us a random integer in Python. Random sample gives us the gives us x random random elements from our container that we provide as the first argument, and the length of the list, which is returned in the result of a sample function, is the second argument k, which is provided as a random integer from 1 to 20 in our case. Yeah, so kind of like that. But as you can see, we have a list at the result, and Redis will not make anything out of that list. We need a string as the name of the key. Because of that, what we can do is use join, like that. Let's run it now, and as you can see, we get random strings of random length. And what we can do right now is use while true Redis client dot set key as what's the problem? Yeah, set key as 1, for example. Now let's run it, and if we go to our Redis, and if let's open Redis CLI, let's write keys from a wildcard. As you can see, we have 6,000 keys, 10,000 keys, so we append random keys to our Redis. That's how it works. Now I'll close that program. That's another template program for Redis that you can use. It literally does nothing, just appends a lot of keys. But now what I want to do? I want to use keys as inside of my Python application. So in our case, we can use Redis client.keys. As you can see, it accepts the same. It accepts the pattern. So let's provide all of the keys to our as our pattern argument inside of the keys function of our Redis library. Let's run it again, and as you can see, we have a big delay. And after that, we return a list of the names of our keys that were found using keys command in Redis. So what's the problem with keys? The real problem is that keys should never be used in production, because it returns a whole list of your results, a whole array. For example, if you have 10,000 keys, as we do in our case, you need to have your programming language, so your program, in our case, our main.py file, will need to create a list, so a container, which has 10,000 elements inside of it. And your Redis will have to create a container inside of it with 10,000 elements to return it as a result. You can see the problem right here. It's really heavy in terms of memory. And in terms of memory, your Redis can literally break down if it does not have enough memory, because that's how Redis works. And if your Redis is in a high load environment, so you have a lot of operations per second with your Redis instances, then if you use keys, a really memory heavy operation, what can happen is you will have your Redis can break down because of that. And instead of keys, we are using scan. So what is the difference with keys and scan? And today we'll talk about scan iter, because as you can see, there are a lot of scan variables right here, or scan functions right here, and I will just use scan because there will be time when we will talk about scan function in Redis.py module, but now I'll just use scan iter because it's easier to explain. So what will happen when we use scan iter? Let's run it again, and generator scan iter at some kind of address. If you know Python and you know generators, you already know what's the big difference between keys and scan in Redis. So we are using scan iter, but deep down it's scan command. So we have keys and scan command. they accept the same arguments, they return the same results, but how they return the results is literally the main difference between them. So in our case, when we wrote keys from our wildcard mask or wildcard pattern, just that pattern, we received the whole list. But when we are talking about scan-iter, we receive our generator. So generator in Python, it's a specific class, a specific structure, a specific pattern that helps you to get your results in small portions. So it's kind of like a stream. A stream when you, for example, instead of taking the whole 10,000 list of elements, you take all of the elements, for example, the first 10 elements, the second 10, the third 10, so you take them using small portions, small packets. That's the real difference. Because your Python instance or any program that you're writing, and REDIS as well, will not store the whole result of the elements at once. They will only store the elements that you need right now. And why is it beneficial? Because if we will, for example, use for element or for key in REDIS scan-iter, because REDIS scan and REDIS keys comment return the name of the keys. So as you saw, there are no values of the keys that we get inside of keys and scan-iter. They only show you what keys are, what keys do you have in your application. Yeah, so only the names of the keys. If we use for key in REDIS scan-iter and let's print those keys, we will receive the same results. Well, that is the connection for the REDIS, and as you can see, we receive the same results as we did in our keys. But those results are not as memory heavy as using keys function inside of REDIS. So in our case, for every key in REDIS scan-iter, we get the result. So that's how it works. Instead of using the whole list of 10,000 elements as the results, we only get them by small portions. And that's another topic that I want to discuss, but now I want to say that just use scan-iter if you work in a production environment. If you're just working in development, then of course you can use keys, but in production always use scan and scan-iter if you're working with redis.py. So use scan because it's much more beneficial in terms of memory use. Okay, so I think that's it, but now let's talk about scan-iter in more details, because scan-iter has its own drawbacks too. So as you can see what we have right here, the first argument is match, but the second one is count. So what is count? Count, it's an integer that shows you how much or how many elements you need to get in one scan command. So as I said, our REDIS instance gets the results in small portions. That means that our REDIS instance will have to execute a lot of commands in our REDIS library. So REDIS will have to execute a lot of commands using scan. For example, we use scan for the first 10 elements, scan for the second 20 for the next 10 elements, and so on. And if you have, for example, 100,000 elements in your REDIS application, what does that mean? That means that you execute tons of queries for your REDIS. So again, when we're talking about keys, function will only execute it once, but it's very memory heavy. In terms of scan-iter, we execute it a lot of times, and we at one specific point in time we spend less memory. But when we are talking about the whole picture, we spend more memory because we execute more commands in REDIS. But those commands are not as impactful as the keys commands because we don't store the whole object in our program, in our case main.py, or in our REDIS server. So it's better to use scan-iter and scan commands in REDIS. But what we can do to improve those commands is to use count argument as our own value. Because if you, for example, if your application can work with 100 elements at a time, so your application can store 100 elements, your Redis server can store 100 elements. That means that you literally can use count as 100 and it will not be as impactful in terms of memory, but your Redis will execute less commands, because in one scan command we get 100 elements. That means, for example, that if you have 100,000 keys, instead of executing how many? 10,000 commands, when we're talking about count as 10, we will execute only 100 commands in Redis. And if your application can handle the load of 100 elements at a time, so again, count shows how many elements one scan command will get you as its result. So by default it's 10, but 10 is a really small number from my point of view. And what you can do is use something as 100, because 100 is not as big as 10,000 elements which are returned in keys command, but it's not as small as 10 elements which are returned in scan command. So yeah, you can use in default scan configuration. So what you can do is use count as 100 and it will work as charm. But of course, you need to think about your application, because you need to know what are your memory capabilities of your Redis instances, what are your application capabilities. So you need to know your application, because in some cases it's beneficial to use 1000. In some cases it's beneficial to use 500, because every application is different, and I cannot tell you what the best value is. But for 70% of applications you can use 100, because it's not as big value as it is, and it's not as small as 10. So that's how it works. So now, for every scan iter command, we'll get 100 elements at the result. Let's run it. And yeah, so that's how our command works. So we only make, so we have 10,000 keys, so we only make 10,000 keys, and because count is 100, we only make, divided by 100, we only make, 10,000, I cannot count, we only make 100, we only make 100 queries. Yeah, we only make 100 queries in our scan iter command. What I want to say is that you always need to tune your count argument in scan iter, because 10 is a really small number. If your application is very memory heavy, so you cannot get a lot of values at once, use 20. You can use 10, you can use even 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but it's really specific for the count argument is specific for every application, so I cannot help you with that until you show me your application, your capabilities, so your servers and so on. But again, you need to always think about your count argument in scan iter, because it can really speed up your Redis. So it can really speed up your code if you use the ideal count argument in your scan iter commands. That's what I wanted to tell you. So I think that's it. That's all of the comments that I wanted to discuss with you today, and what I want to do is finish my program by using redis client.get as key. So as I said, scan iter and keys command return only the names of the arguments in our Redis, so the names of the keys of our Redis instance. And if you want to get the value of the Redis key, if you want to get all of the values of the Redis keys from scan iter and keys command, what you can do is use redis client get from key. But as you saw, our program was running for 3, 5, maybe even 10 seconds. Because what we're doing right now is for every key that we found in scan iter, we literally run a command. So for every 10,000 keys, you run 10,000 commands, 10,000 queries, so you run a lot of additional queries in your Redis. And if you can omit that redis client get key, you should always do that. Okay, so that's how it works. Never make excessive calls for anything in programming. So for database, as I told you about that in Django SQL queries optimization, never make excessive queries in Redis, so never make excessive queries. That's kind of the rule. Today we talked about incur, incurby, keys and scan commands in Redis. So I hope you liked that video. Leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe. Thank you and good luck.